Veteran's dog. Barks relentlessly at stranger. When the man turns around, they both freeze. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the well-manicured grass of Oakwood Park, a small suburban oasis nestled between rows of quaint houses and bustling streets. The air was filled with the gentle rustling of leaves, punctuated by the distant laughter of children and the occasional bark of a dog. It was here, amidst this tranquil scene, that Ben found himself walking alongside his loyal companion, Max. Ben, a veteran in his early 40s, moved with a measured gait that spoke of both physical and emotional weight. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had seen more than his fair share of life's hardships, yet his eyes remained alert and watchful. Dressed in comfortable jeans and a faded olive-green t-shirt that hinted at his military past, he cut an unassuming figure in the peaceful park setting. At his side trotted Max, a magnificent German shepherd whose sleek coat gleamed in the golden light of the fading day. Max was more than just a pet. He was a former military service dog, a brother in arms who had stood by Ben's side through the chaos and carnage of war. Their bond, forged in the crucible of combat, was unbreakable and profound. As they made their way along the winding path, Ben found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them both to this quiet corner of suburban life. The transition from the structured, high-stakes world of military service to the seemingly mundane routines of civilian existence had been far from easy. There were days when the silence felt oppressive, when the lack of clear mission objectives left him feeling adrift and purposeless. But it was in moments like these, walking through the park with Max, that Ben found a semblance of peace. The simple act of putting one foot in front of the other, feeling the solid earth beneath his feet and the gentle tug of Max's leash in his hand, provided an anchor to the present. It was a far cry from the adrenaline-fueled operations of his past, but it offered its own kind of solace. As they passed by the playground, Ben couldn't help but smile at the sight of children climbing, swinging, and chasing each other with carefree abandon. Their laughter echoed across the park, a stark contrast to the sounds that often haunted his dreams. He watched as parents chatted on nearby benches, their conversations a soothing backdrop of normalcy. Max, ever vigilant, kept pace with Ben, his ears occasionally twitching at the various sounds around them. Despite his training as a military dog, Max had adapted well to civilian life, proving to be as adept at providing emotional support as he had been at detecting threats in war-torn landscapes. Ben often marveled at the dog's ability to sense his moods, offering a comforting presence during sleepless nights or anxiety-ridden days. Their walk took them past joggers pounding the pavement, couples strolling hand in hand, and other dog walkers exchanging friendly nods. Ben found himself appreciating the simple beauty of these everyday interactions, a reminder of the world he had fought to protect. It was a world far removed from the harsh realities of combat, yet one that carried its own challenges and complexities. As they rounded a bend in the path, the park opened up to reveal a small pond, its surface shimmering in the late afternoon light. Ben paused for a moment, allowing Max to sniff at the water's edge while he took in the serene view. A family of ducks glided across the pond, creating gentle ripples that spread outward in concentric circles. The sight brought a sense of calm to Ben's often turbulent mind, a reminder that even in the midst of life's storms, moments of tranquility could be found. Continuing their walk, Ben and Max made their way towards a cluster of old oak trees that stood like sentinels at the park's edge. The gnarled branches reached skyward, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. It was here, in the dappled shade of these ancient trees, that Ben often found himself lost in thought, contemplating the path that had led him to this point in his life. As they approached the trees, Max's demeanor suddenly changed. The relaxed gait of moments before was replaced by a rigid posture, his ears perking up and his attention laser-focused on something in the distance. Ben, attuned to his companion's every movement, immediately sensed the shift. Years of training and shared experiences had taught him to trust Max's instincts implicitly. Ben's own senses heightened, his body tensing as he scanned the area for any sign of threat. The peaceful atmosphere of the park seemed to waver, like a mirage shimmering in the heat. He tightened his grip on Max's leash, feeling the sudden tension thrumming through the dog's body. It was then that Ben noticed a man standing alone beneath one of the oak trees. At first glance, there was nothing particularly remarkable about him. He was dressed casually in a jacket and jeans, his posture relaxed as he gazed out over the park. Yet something about him had triggered Max's alert response, and Ben knew better than to ignore it. As they drew closer, Max let out a low, rumbling growl. The sound, so at odds with the dog's usual calm demeanor in the park, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Ben's system. His mind raced, assessing potential threats and escape routes, old habits resurging with startling clarity. The man under the tree remained oblivious to their approach, his back turned to Ben and Max. But as Max's growl deepened into a series of sharp, insistent barks, the stranger slowly began to turn. Ben watched, his heart pounding, as the man's profile came into view. There was something hauntingly familiar about the set of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw, and then, as the man fully faced them, time seemed to stand still. Ben felt the world tilt on its axis as recognition dawned, bringing with it a flood of memories and emotions he had long thought buried. The face that stared back at him was one he knew all too well, a face he had last seen in the midst of gunfire and chaos, a lifetime ago, in a war-torn land far from this peaceful park. It was David, his former brother-in-arms, a man he had believed lost to the ravages of war. As their eyes met across the sun-dappled grass, Ben felt the carefully constructed normalcy of his civilian life begin to crumble. The past, it seemed, had finally caught up with him, bringing with it a maelstrom of unresolved questions and long-suppressed feelings. The quiet afternoon in the park had suddenly become the backdrop for a reunion that would shake the foundations of Ben's hard-won peace. As Max continued to bark, his agitation a mirror of Ben's inner turmoil, the two men stood frozen, separated by years of silence and shared trauma. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force both to confront the ghosts of their shared past and the uncertain path that lay ahead. The air in Oakwood Park, once filled with the gentle sounds of a peaceful afternoon, now reverberated with the sharp, insistent barking of Max. The German shepherd's powerful voice cut through the ambient noise, drawing curious and concerned glances from nearby parkgoers. Children paused in their play, joggers slowed their pace, and couples on benches turned to look at the source of the commotion. Ben, his muscles taut with tension, maintained a firm grip on Max's leash. The familiar weight of the leather strap in his hand grounded him as his mind raced to process the sight before him. David, a ghost from his past, a brother he had mourned, stood mere yards away, his presence as unexpected as a sandstorm in this suburban oasis. Max's barking intensified, each thunderous bark seeming to echo the pounding of Ben's heart. The dog's hackles were raised, his tail rigid, every fiber of his being focused on the man beneath the oak tree. It was a posture Ben had seen countless times during their tours of duty, a clear signal that Max had detected a potential threat. But this was no war zone, and the threat was a man Ben had once trusted with his life. "Max, easy," Ben murmured, his voice low and steady despite the turmoil roiling within him. His attempt to calm the dog fell on deaf ears as Max continued his relentless barking, straining against the leash with a determination that spoke of more than just territorial instinct. David remained rooted to the spot, his face a mask of shock and something else. Was it fear? Guilt? The distance between them seemed to stretch and contract, the years of silence and unanswered questions creating an almost palpable barrier. Ben found himself studying David's face, noting the new lines around his eyes, the flecks of gray at his temples. Time had changed them both, but there was no mistaking the man who had once been as close as a brother. As Max's barking reached a fevered pitch, Ben became acutely aware of the scene they were creating. A young mother hurriedly ushered her children away from the commotion, casting a wary glance over her shoulder. An elderly man on a nearby bench shook his head disapprovingly, muttering something about undisciplined animals. The peaceful bubble of the park had been well and truly burst. "Max, enough!" Ben's command came out sharper than intended, laced with the authority of his military days. To his surprise, Max's barking subsided to a low, continuous growl, a compromise between obedience to his master and the undeniable urge to alert, to protect. The sudden reduction in volume seemed to break the spell that had held David immobile. He took a halting step backward, his eyes darting between Ben and Max, then to the gathering crowd of onlookers. For a moment, Ben thought he might turn and flee, disappearing once again into the ether of lost connections and unanswered questions. "David!" Ben called out, his voice rough with emotion. "David, wait." The sound of his name seemed to freeze David in his tracks. He stood, half-turned as if caught between flight and confrontation, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. The jacket he wore, Ben now noticed, hung loosely on his frame, as if he had lost weight or was carrying a burden that pressed down upon his shoulders. Max, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, ceased his growling but remained alert, his eyes never leaving David. The dog's posture was a reflection of Ben's own internal state, poised on a knife's edge between past and present, between the comfort of routine and the upheaval of unexpected reunions. As the initial shock began to ebb, questions flooded Ben's mind. Where had David been all these years? Why had he disappeared without a trace, leaving his brothers in arms to mourn him? What twist of fate had brought him to this park, on this day, crossing paths with the very people he had left behind? The park around them seemed to recede, the curious onlookers fading into the background as Ben took a tentative step forward. Max moved with him, in perfect sync as always, a living reminder of the bond forged in the crucible of war. That bond had once extended to David as well, a brotherhood that had seemed unbreakable until the moment it shattered. I didn't expect to see you here," David finally spoke, his voice barely audible above the resumed murmur of park activity. The words, so inadequate in the face of their shared history, hung in the air between them. Ben felt a surge of emotions, relief at hearing David's voice after so long, anger at the years of silence, confusion at the circumstances of their reunion. He opened his mouth to respond, but found the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say to encapsulate the years of grief, of wondering, of trying to move forward while a piece of his past remained unresolved? Max, ever attuned to Ben's emotional state, pressed closer to his side. The warmth of the dog's body against his leg provided a measure of comfort, a reminder that regardless of the ghosts of the past, he was not facing this moment alone. The sun had begun its descent towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the park. The golden hour light painted the scene in warm hues, a stark contrast to the cold uncertainty that had settled over the reunion. Families were starting to pack up their picnic baskets, and the sound of car doors slamming in the distant parking lot signaled the end of another day in Oakwood Park. But for Ben and David, time seemed to stand still. The carefully constructed routines of their separate lives had been shattered by this chance encounter, leaving them adrift in a sea of unresolved emotions and unanswered questions. The park, once a sanctuary of peace for Ben, had become the stage for a confrontation long overdue. As they stood facing each other, the weight of their shared past pressing down upon them, Ben realized that the quiet afternoon walk he had set out on had become a journey into the very heart of his unresolved trauma. The path forward was unclear, obscured by the shadows of memory and the fog of lost years. Max, his barking now silenced, but his alertness undiminished, stood as a bridge between past and present. In his faithful companionship, Ben found the strength to take another step forward, closing the gap between himself and the man who had once been closer than a brother. The moment stretched, pregnant with possibility. Would this be a reconciliation or a final goodbye? A chance to heal old wounds or the reopening of scars long thought closed? As the light faded and the park emptied around them, Ben and David stood on the precipice of a conversation years in the making, with Max as their steadfast witness. The quiet afternoon had given way to an evening fraught with tension and possibility. As Ben drew a deep breath, preparing to break the silence that yawned between them, he knew that whatever came next would irrevocably change the careful balance he had struck in his post-war life. the ghosts of the past, embodied in David's unexpected presence, demanded to be acknowledged, their spectral fingers reaching across time to tap on the walls of the present. With Max at his side, a living tether to both his past and his present, Ben steeled himself for what was to come. The park, once a backdrop for quiet contemplation, had become the setting for a reunion that would force both men to confront the choices that had led them to this moment, and to navigate the treacherous waters of memory, loyalty. He saw David as he had been years ago. Young, determined, with a glint of humor in his eyes, even in the darkest moments of their deployment. He remembered nights spent huddled in desert foxholes, sharing whispered conversations about hopes and fears, about the lives they'd left behind and the futures they dreamed of. He recalled the easy camaraderie of their unit, the unshakable trust that came from depending on each other for survival. And then, unbidden, came the memory of that last, fateful mission. The chaos of the ambush, the deafening rattle of gunfire, the acrid smell of smoke and fear. In his mind's eye, Ben saw again the moment when David had disappeared into the swirling dust and confusion of battle. The frantic search that followed, the growing dread as hours turned into days with no sign of their missing brother in arms. The eventual, painful acceptance that David was gone, another name to be etched on memorials and carried in the hearts of those left behind. Yet here, David stood, flesh and blood, looking older and wearier, but undeniably alive. The reality of his presence struck Ben like a physical blow, a mixture of relief, anger, and confusion swirling within him. Max, sensing the tension radiating from his master, let out a low whine. The sound seemed to break the spell that had held both men motionless. David flinched, his eyes darting to the dog before returning to Ben's face. "Ben," David finally spoke, his voice hoarse and uncertain. I don't know what to say." The sound of David's voice, so familiar yet changed by the years, sent a jolt through Ben. It was a voice he had heard in his dreams and nightmares, a voice he had never expected to hear again in the waking world. "You don't know what to say?" Ben repeated, a hint of bitterness creeping into his tone. "After all these years, after everything we went through, that's all you have?" David winced at the words, his shoulders hunching as if under a physical weight. "I know it's not enough," he said softly. "Nothing could be enough." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. It lent an almost surreal quality to the scene, as if this moment of recognition was taking place in a world slightly removed from reality. Ben took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "We thought you were dead, David," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We searched for you. We mourned you. And all this time, you were... what? Living a normal life somewhere." David's face contorted with pain and guilt. "It wasn't like that," he protested weakly. I couldn't come back, not after what happened." The vague response only fueled Ben's frustration. "What happened? The ambush. We all went through that, David. We all carried the scars, but we carried them together." As Ben spoke, memories of the aftermath of David's disappearance flooded his mind. He remembered the sleepless nights, the endless debriefings, the gut-wrenching task of writing letters to David's family. He thought of the other members of their unit, Jake, with his booming laugh, Sarah, with her quick wit, Miguel with his quiet strength. How they had all struggled to make sense of losing one of their own. How they had leaned on each other to get through the darkness that followed. "You weren't the only one who suffered," Ben continued, his voice low and intense. "We all did. But we faced it together. We helped each other heal. Or at least, we tried to." David's eyes, which had been darting around as if seeking an escape, finally met Ben's. In them, Ben saw a depth of pain and regret that matched his own. "I know," David whispered. "I know I let you all down. I've carried that knowledge every day since I left." The admission, simple as it was, seemed to deflate some of the anger that had been building in Ben. In its place came a profound sadness, a mourning for the years of friendship lost, for the brotherhood fractured by trauma and misunderstanding. Max, who had been standing alert at Ben's side, seemed to sense the shift in mood. He took a tentative step towards David, his tail giving a hesitant wag. David looked down at the dog, a ghost of a smile flickering across his face. Is this Max?" he asked, his voice tinged with wonder. "He was just a pup when I last saw him." Ben nodded, momentarily thrown by this sudden shift to safer conversational ground. "Yeah, it's him. He's been with me since we got back." David slowly extended a hand, allowing Max to sniff it. The dog's tail wagged more confidently, and he pushed his nose into David's palm. This simple act of acceptance from Max seemed to release some of the tension in the air. "He remembers you," Ben said softly, watching as David gently stroked Max's head. "Dogs don't forget, neither do people." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. David's hand stilled on Max's fur, and he looked up at Ben, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I never forgot," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not for a single day. I wanted to reach out, to explain, but I didn't know how. I didn't think I had the right after what I'd done." Ben felt his own eyes stinging, the emotions he'd kept bottled up for so long threatening to spill over. "What did you do, David?" he asked, his voice gentle now. "What happened out there?" David straightened up, his hand falling away from Max. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for a confession long overdue. "It's a long story," he said, "one I've never told anyone. But if you're willing to listen, I think it's time I finally told the truth." As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the park, Ben found himself nodding. The anger and confusion of the initial recognition had given way to a deep-seated need for understanding, for closure. "I'm listening," he said simply. And so, as the day faded into evening and the park emptied around them, two old friends and a faithful dog began the long, painful process of bridging the gap carved by years of silence and misunderstanding. The moment of recognition had passed, giving way to something deeper, a chance for redemption, for healing, and perhaps for the renewal of a brotherhood once thought lost forever. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Ben and David found themselves walking slowly through the now quiet park. Max padded alongside them, his earlier agitation replaced by a watchful calm. The tension between the two men was palpable, a taut wire stretched between past and present. They came to a stop near a weathered wooden bench, its paint peeling and faded by years of sun and rain. It seemed a fitting spot for the conversation that lay ahead, worn and battered, but still standing. Ben gestured to the bench, and David nodded, lowering himself onto it with a sigh that spoke of more than just physical weariness. Ben remained standing, his posture rigid, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Max sat at his feet, alert and attentive, his eyes darting between the two men, as if trying to make sense of the complex emotions swirling around them. "So," Ben began, his voice cutting through the evening quiet, "you said you had a story to tell, a reason for disappearing on us, on me." The hurt in his voice was unmistakable, a wound that had never fully healed. David winced at the words, his shoulders hunching as if under a physical weight. He stared at his hands, clasped tightly in his lap, before slowly raising his eyes to meet Ben's gaze. "I do," he said softly. "But I don't know if you'll understand. Hell, I'm not sure I understand it myself, even after all these years." Ben's jaw tightened, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "Try me," he said, his tone challenging. "After everything we've been through, everything we were to each other, don't you think I deserve at least that much?" David nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Ben's face. "You're right," he admitted. "You deserve the truth. All of you do. I've carried this alone for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to share the burden anymore." As David spoke, Ben found himself studying his old friend's face, noting the new lines etched around his eyes and mouth, the gray streaking his once dark hair. Time had changed them both, but there was something more than just age weighing David down. It was as if he carried an invisible load, one that bent his shoulders and dimmed the light in his eyes. "That was always your problem," Ben said, his voice softening slightly. "You tried to carry everything yourself. Even back then, you'd push yourself to the limit rather than ask for help." A ghost of a smile flickered across David's face. "You remember that, huh?" "How could I forget?" Ben replied, a hint of warmth creeping into his tone. "You were the most stubborn son of a gun in the unit. Drove the rest of us crazy sometimes." For a moment, the years seemed to fall away, and they were back in the desert, young men bound by duty and brotherhood. But the moment passed quickly, reality reasserting itself as David's smile faded. "I guess some things never change," David said ruefully. "Maybe if I'd been better at asking for help, things might have turned out differently." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Ben felt a surge of emotions, anger at the years lost, frustration at David's cryptic words, and underneath it all, a deep, aching sadness for the friendship that had been fractured. "So ask now," Ben said, his voice low and intense. "We're here, aren't we? After all these years, by some twist of fate, we found each other again. So talk to me, David. Tell me what happened. Tell me why you left us, left me, thinking you were dead all this time." David took a deep breath, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "It started during that last mission," he began. "The ambush, do you remember?" Ben nodded, his throat tightening at the memory. "How could I forget? It was chaos. We were pinned down, outgunned. I thought we were all going to die there." "So did I," David admitted. "But then something happened. Something I've never told anyone about. Something I'm not sure I can explain, even now." As David paused, gathering his thoughts, Ben found himself holding his breath. This was it, the moment of truth he had been waiting for, the explanation for years of absence and silence. Yet a part of him was afraid of what he might hear, of how it might change the memory of the friend he had mourned for so long. Max, sensing the heightened emotions, let out a soft whine. Ben absently reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, the familiar gesture grounding him in the present moment. "Whatever it is, David," Ben said, his voice steady, "I'm here to listen. No judgment, no recriminations, just the truth. That's all I'm asking for." David nodded, taking another deep breath. "Okay," he said, his voice stronger now. "Okay. It all started when we got separated during the firefight. I was trying to flank the enemy position, provide some cover fire for the rest of you, but I miscalculated, ended up cut off." As David began to recount the events of that fateful day, Ben felt himself being drawn back in time. The sounds of the peaceful park faded away, replaced by the remembered crack of gunfire and the shouts of men in battle. The story that unfolded was one of fear and desperation, of split-second decisions and their far-reaching consequences. With each word, the tension between them shifted, morphing into something more complex. There was still anger and hurt, yes, but also a growing understanding, a shared recognition of the scars they both carried from their time in war. As the night deepened around them, two old friends, separated by years of silence and misunderstanding, began the painful but necessary process of reconnecting. Their conversation, long overdue, would stretch into the night, filled with difficult truths and painful memories. But with each word spoken, each memory shared, the possibility of healing, of rebuilding what had been lost, grew stronger. The park, now silent and shrouded in darkness, stood witness to this reunion of old friends, this confrontation of past and present. And through it all, Max remained a steady presence, a living link between the men they had been and the men they had become. The night had fully settled over Oakwood Park, the darkness broken only by the soft glow of distant streetlights. Ben and David sat side by side on the weathered bench, their earlier tension giving way to a shared weariness as David's story unfolded. Max lay at their feet, his chin resting on his paws, a silent guardian in the quiet night. David's voice, low and strained, carried the weight of years of unspoken guilt as he continued his tale. After I got separated from the unit, I found myself pinned down behind a half-collapsed wall. The enemy fire was intense, and I couldn't see a way out. I was sure that was it for me. Ben nodded, remembering the chaos of that day. We could hear the firefight, but we couldn't get to you. The terrain was too exposed. I know, David said, a hint of old fear creeping into his voice. I could hear you guys too, but it was like you were a million miles away. And then it happened. He paused, his hands clenching and unclenching in his lap. Ben waited, sensing that whatever came next was at the heart of David's disappearance. There was this kid, David finally continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Couldn't have been more than 14 or 15. He came around the corner of the building, an AK in his hands. Our eyes met, and for a second, just a split second, I saw fear, the same fear I was feeling. Ben felt a chill run down his spine, a sick feeling settling in his stomach as he began to understand where this was going. I didn't think, David said, his voice cracking. I just reacted. My training kicked in, and I fired. The kid went down, and I saw the light go out of his eyes. Just like that. A life snuffed out. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the ghosts of decisions made in the heat of battle, lives forever altered in the blink of an eye. David, Ben started, but David shook his head, needing to continue. I know what you're going to say. It was war. It was him or me. I've told myself that 1,000 times, but in that moment, all I could think was that I'd killed someone's child. Someone who might not have even understood what he was fighting for. Ben felt a lump forming in his throat. They had all faced similar situations, made split-second decisions that would haunt them. But he could see that for David, this moment had become a turning point, a wound that had never healed. After that, David continued, everything's a blur. I remember running, not caring about the gunfire around me. I couldn't face going back. Couldn't face you all, knowing what I'd done. So I kept running. The pieces were starting to fall into place for Ben. The mysterious disappearance, the years of silence, it all stemmed from this moment of trauma and the crushing guilt that followed. Why didn't you come to us? Ben asked, his voice rough with emotion. We were your brothers, David. We would have understood. We could have helped you through it. David shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. Could you really have understood? I couldn't even understand it myself. All I knew was that I couldn't be that person anymore. The soldier, the killer. I needed to get as far away from that life as possible. As David spoke, Ben found himself transported back to the aftermath of that mission. He remembered the frantic search, the growing dread as hours turned into days with no sign of David. He thought of the grief that had settled over the unit, the guilt they had all carried, wondering if they could have done more to save their brother in arms. We mourned you, Ben said softly. We carried your memory with us, every mission, every moment. You were there with us, even if only in spirit. And all this time, you were out there somewhere, carrying this burden alone. David's shoulders slumped, the weight of his confession seeming to press him down. I'm sorry, he whispered. I know it's not enough, but I am truly sorry for leaving, for not reaching out, for letting you all think I was dead. I thought I was protecting you, in a way, protecting you from the person I'd become. Ben felt a surge of conflicting emotions, anger at the years of unnecessary grief, compassion for the pain David had carried, and a deep sadness for the brotherhood that had been fractured by trauma and misunderstanding. You know, Ben said after a long moment, his voice low and thoughtful, We all carried our demons back from that place. Every one of us had moments we couldn't shake, decisions we questioned, but we faced them together. We helped each other heal, or at least tried to. He paused, looking out into the darkness of the park. In the distance, a car horn honked, a brief reminder of the world beyond their bubble of shared memory and pain. "I won't lie to you, David," Ben continued. "What you did, disappearing like that, it hurt. It hurt all of us. We questioned everything about that mission, about ourselves. We wondered if we could have done more, if we had somehow failed you." David flinched at these words, guilt etching deeper lines into his face. "I never meant to cause you all that pain," he said softly. "I was so caught up in my own guilt, my own need to escape, that I didn't think about how it would affect everyone else. That's another weight I've had to carry." Max, sensing the heightened emotions, sat up and rested his head on David's knee. Almost unconsciously, David began to stroke the dog's fur, the repetitive motion seeming to calm him. "You remember Jake?" Ben asked suddenly. David nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Of course. How could I forget? Always cracking jokes, even in the worst situations." "He took your disappearance hard," Ben said. "Blamed himself for not watching your back. He started taking crazy risks on missions, like he was trying to make up for losing you. It took a long time for him to find his balance again." David closed his eyes, pain etched across his features. "I had no idea," he whispered. "I never thought. God, I've been so selfish." Ben shook his head. "It wasn't selfishness, David. It was trauma, pain. We've all been there, in one way or another. The difference is, we had each other to lean on. You chose to face it alone." A heavy silence fell between them, filled with the weight of years lost and the echoes of shared trauma. The night air had grown cooler, and Ben suppressed a shiver, though whether from the chill or the intensity of the conversation, he couldn't say. "I've thought about reaching out so many times over the years," David said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'd pick up the phone, start dialing, and then I'd freeze. How could I explain? How could I ask for forgiveness after so long?" Ben turned to look at his old friend, really look at him. In the dim light, he could see the toll the years of silence and self-imposed exile had taken. David's face was lined with guilt and regret, his eyes carrying a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "You know," Ben said slowly, "there's something my therapist told me once, back when I was first struggling with my own war memories. She said, healing isn't about erasing the past, it's about learning to live with it, to carry it in a way that doesn't destroy you." David looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Do you think that's possible, after everything?" Ben was quiet for a moment, considering. The anger and hurt he'd carried for so long were still there, but alongside them now was a growing understanding, a recognition of the shared pain that had driven them both to this moment. "I think," he said finally, "that it's never too late to start. We can't change what happened, David. We can't erase the years of silence or the pain we've both carried. But maybe we can start to build something new, something that honors our past without being trapped by it." As he spoke, Ben felt something shift inside him. The tightly wound knot of grief and anger that he'd carried for so long began to loosen, just a little. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. That would take time and more conversations like this one. But it was a start, a small step towards healing. David nodded slowly, his hand still absently stroking Max's fur. "I'd like that," he said softly. "I know I don't deserve a second chance, but if you're willing to give it, I'd like to try." The park around them was silent now, the distant sounds of the city muffled by the night. In this quiet bubble, two men who had once been closer than brothers began the long, painful process of reconnecting, of bridging the gap carved by years of silence and misunderstanding. As they sat there, the weight of the past heavy between them but no longer insurmountable, the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. A new day was coming, bringing with it the possibility of redemption, of healing, and perhaps of a brotherhood reforged in the crucible of shared pain and mutual understanding. The road ahead would not be easy. There were more conversations to be had, more painful truths to face. But as the night gave way to morning, both Ben and David felt a spark of hope that had long been absent. The past, with all its trauma and regret, could not be changed. But the future, that was still theirs to shape, together. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, Ben and David remained on the park bench, their conversation having stretched through the long night. Max, ever faithful, dozed at their feet, occasionally twitching in his sleep as if chasing dream rabbits. The park was coming alive around them, early morning joggers and dog walkers beginning to populate the paths. But for Ben and David, the world had narrowed to this bench, this moment, as they continued to unravel the threads of their shared past. "So what happened after you ran?" Ben asked, his voice hoarse from hours of talking. "Where did you go?" David ran a hand through his hair, his eyes distant as he recalled those chaotic days. "I just kept moving," he said. "I made my way to a small village, traded my uniform for civilian clothes. From there, I hitched rides, took odd jobs, anything to keep moving, to stay anonymous." Ben shook his head, trying to imagine the fear and desperation that must have driven his friend. "Didn't you think about coming back? About letting us know you were alive?" "Every day," David admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But the longer I was gone, the harder it became. I convinced myself that it was better this way, that you were all better off thinking I was dead rather than knowing what I'd become." Ben felt a surge of frustration. "That wasn't your decision to make, David. We were a team, a family. We should have faced it together." David nodded, shame etching lines into his face. "I know that now. But back then, I was lost, Ben. Lost in a way I'd never been before. The guilt, the fear, the self-loathing, it was like a fog I couldn't find my way out of." As David spoke, Ben found himself remembering the aftermath of that fateful mission. The endless debriefings, the nightmares that plagued them all, the slow, painful process of trying to readjust to life back home. They had all struggled, but they had struggled together. "We could have helped you," Ben said softly. "We all had our demons to face. Jake with his recklessness, Sarah with her insomnia, Miguel with his drinking. We weren't perfect, but we were there for each other." David's eyes filled with tears. "I see that now. God, I was so stupid, so selfish." Ben reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing a hand on David's shoulder. It was the first physical contact they'd had in years, and he felt David stiffen before slowly relaxing under his touch. "It wasn't selfishness," Ben said firmly. "It was trauma, pain. We've all been there, in one way or another. The difference is, we had each other to lean on. You chose to face it alone." David nodded, wiping at his eyes. "I thought I was protecting you all," he said. "From the person I'd become, from the shame I carried. But I see now that I was really just protecting myself. From facing what I'd done, from having to confront the reality of it all." As David spoke, Ben felt something shift inside him. The anger and hurt he'd carried for so long were still there, but alongside them now was a growing understanding, a recognition of the shared pain that had driven them both to this moment. "So what now?" Ben asked, voicing the question that hung between them. "Where do we go from here?" David looked up, meeting Ben's gaze for the first time in hours. "I don't know," he admitted. "I never thought I'd get this far. Never thought I'd have the chance to explain, to apologize. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but—" "It's not about deserving," Ben interrupted. "It's about healing. For both of us." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Look, David, I can't pretend the last few years didn't happen. I can't erase the pain, the grief we all went through. But maybe we can start to build something new, something that honors our past without being trapped by it." David nodded slowly, hope flickering in his eyes. "I'd like that," he said softly. "I know it won't be easy, But if you're willing to try, I want to make things right. With you, with the others, with myself." As if sensing the shift in mood, Max lifted his head, looking between the two men with intelligent eyes. Ben reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, drawing comfort from the familiar gesture. "It won't be easy," Ben agreed. "There's a lot of hurt to work through, a lot of trust to rebuild, and it's not just about us. There's Jake, Sarah, Miguel, all the others. They deserve to know the truth too." David's face paled slightly, but he nodded. "You're right. I owe them all an explanation, an apology. Do you think they'll want to see me?" Ben considered for a moment. "I can't speak for them," he said honestly. "But I know they've missed you, mourned you. Finding out you're alive, it'll be a shock, but I think, in time, they'll be glad to have you back." As they sat there, the weight of the past heavy between them but no longer insurmountable, the park around them came fully to life. The sounds of children laughing on the playground, of dogs barking in the distance, of life continuing in all its messy, beautiful complexity, seemed to underscore the possibility of new beginnings. "So, what's the first step?" David asked, his voice stronger now, more resolved. Ben stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours of sitting. Max rose with him, tail wagging as if he sensed a decision had been made. "The first step," Ben said, extending a hand to David, "is breakfast. We've been out here all night, and I don't know about you, but I'm starving." David looked at the offered hand for a moment before taking it, allowing Ben to pull him to his feet. "Breakfast sounds good," he said, a small smile touching his lips. And then we take it, one day at a time," Ben said. "We talk, we listen, we try to understand. We reach out to the others when you're ready. And we remember that healing isn't a destination, it's a journey." As they began to walk towards the park exit, Max trotting happily beside them, Ben felt a sense of cautious hope. The road ahead would not be easy. There were more conversations to be had, more painful truths to face. But as the new day dawned around them, both Ben and David felt a spark of possibility that had long been absent. The past, with all its trauma and regret, could not be changed. But the future, that was still theirs to shape, together. And for the first time in years, that future held the promise of redemption, of healing, and of a brotherhood reforged in the crucible of shared pain and mutual understanding. As they left the park, stepping out into a world that seemed somehow brighter than it had been just hours before, both men carried with them the weight of the past and the hope for the future. The truth behind David's disappearance had finally come to light, and with it, the chance for a new beginning. It was a beginning fraught with challenges, but also rich with the possibility of redemption and renewed friendship. The story of Ben and David was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning anew. But as they walked side by side, with Max as their faithful companion, they took the first steps on a path of healing, forgiveness, and the rekindling of a brotherhood that had been bent, but never truly broken.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.